Good morning, my name is Shannon, Acting Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra. Welcome to This Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Francis.
The Treasurer, Joe Hockey, has put his foot in it again this week with his comment on getting a good job and housing affordability. Is this another example of Hockey not thinking before he speaks, and is he causing too many issues to remain as Treasurer?
Well, it's certainly the latest in a long line of gaffes by the Treasurer, and his colleagues are in some despair over him because, after all, this should be still a period of selling the positives of the budget. Joe Hockey did have something of a boost after the budget, after a dreadful 12 months following the first budget, but he came out of the budget in May looking a bit stronger, but then, of course, he's fallen into another hole. Certainly there are many people in the Liberal Party who think that someone else would do a better job as Treasurer than Joe Hockey. Scott Morrison in particular is a favoured name. But in practice, the fortunes of Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey are bound together. If Tony Abbott tried to move Joe Hockey, he would not probably go quietly. There would be a tremendous upheaval and more negatives than positives.
Despite the housing bubble then, in Sydney especially, the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens has said this week that there may be further rate cuts. What can the government do to strengthen economic growth?
Glenn Stevens was making the point that the Reserve Bank is open to the possibility of another rate cut, but that too much emphasis should not be put on monetary policy. And he wants the government to encourage confidence. He suggests in particular more infrastructure activity would be one way of doing this, but what he's lamenting is that political decision making really seems to just get bogged down. You don't have bipartisanship on a whole lot of key things, and this is meaning that you're not getting the confidence coming through. So I think it was a wake-up call from the Reserve Bank, and remember that Glenn Stevens is very careful in what he says. He's not a Joe Hockey. He doesn't make off-the-cuff comments. So what he's saying should be taken pretty seriously.
Moving back to a topic that we covered last week then, the government's plan to strip citizenship from dual citizens engaged in terrorist activity. The government's own Freedom Commissioner Tim Wilson has added his voice to the chorus of people who appear to be concerned about this. Will this plan continue to be controversial?
I think it certainly will. The Tim Wilson contribution is a quite important one because he was appointed by this government, designated the so-called Freedom Commissioner, and he is sympathetic broadly, of course, to the government's side of politics. So when he's sounding a warning note, it does show that across the political spectrum, people are worried about this measure. And the debate is very much centring on whether it should be a ministerial decision to strip someone of their citizenship, subject to review, or whether it should be a judicial decision. And the critics are increasingly saying that to make it a ministerial decision, especially if it's only one minister, the immigration minister, is not the way to go. And also, of course, there's some question about whether that would even be constitutional. So I think this debate has a long way to run before there's a final decision.
So the debate is more about the mechanism that you might use to do this rather than the actual policy itself.
The debate is about the mechanism, but on the policy, I think there's general agreement that it's okay to strip people who are associated with terrorism of citizenship if they're dual citizens, but there's a lot of discussion and argument around the next stage, which Tony Abbott would like to go to, and which is out for community discussion, that is to try and strip people who have just Australian citizenship but might be eligible for citizenship of another country.
Another issue that has raised its head again this week is union corruption, and it has already claimed one victim this week. A former AWU official who was an MP in the Victorian Parliament had to step down as government whip after allegations against him. Bill Shorten is getting caught up in this debate now too again in regard to companies paying union dues for AWU workers. Will this turn out to be damaging for Shorten? How important is this?
It's impossible to know at this stage how damaging, how important for Bill Shorten in particular, personally, because we don't yet know what further evidence might be given. But I think it is a difficulty, both potentially for him personally, but also because it does link back to his role in the union movement, a numbers man, a factional person in the Labor Party, because remember, the more AWU members the better their position for delegates to the Labor Party. So it brings back these union ties. Unions are not all that popular in the community, and people think they have too much power. And it also comes, I believe, at quite a difficult time for Bill Shorten. Tony Abbott has been catching him up and overtaking him in ratings. Now, Labor is still ahead in the polls, but nevertheless, the gap has closed a bit since the beginning of the year, when it was in such a strong position. And Bill Shorten has a number of challenges coming up. He's got the ALP National Conference. He's got having to put together policy and release policy that makes Labor more in the frame, more a potential target. So I think that the next few months will be quite challenging for the opposition leader.
What do you think he has to do in order to confirm his strong leadership of the ALP and as an opposition leader?
I think the first task is to manage the ALP National Conference, and one of the big issues there will be the question of whether a Labor government could turn back votes. At the moment, that's not the policy. If the conference doesn't give some room to do that, I think it'll be very difficult for Bill Shorten in the election campaign. And he's got to produce policies that both go to people's needs and concerns, things like housing affordability, education, health, and so on. He's also got to produce some inspirational policies that capture the imagination, and that's difficult too when you've got a rather jaded and cynical electorate.
Well, we will see what he manages to do then in the next few months. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Francis.